If you've ever wondered how Indigenous people continue to be so attuned to the landscapes they live on, it could help to understand animism. There is a way of being and knowing that is innate to all humans. Some might call it magic. Animism teaches us about the nature of human and non-human perception and how to bridge these worlds. My name is Isaias Hernandez and this is Queer Brown Vegan. My platform is to bring you environmental education that's focusing on intersectional issues rather than ignoring them. If you like what you see here, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe because it helps me grow my channel and bring you more educational content. Magic, in its perhaps most primordial sense, is the experience existing in a world made up of multiple intelligences, the intuition that every form one perceives, from the swallow swapping overhead to the fly on a blade of grass, and indeed the blade of grass itself, is an experience form of any entity with its own predications and sensations, albeit sensations that are very different from our own. This excerpt is from The Spell of Sensius, a book from 1996 that explores how our senses have been dulled and what it could mean for how we experience life. What exactly is animism? Animism is a way of thinking that sees all things as animate. Lake, oceans, rock, man-made objects, hillsides, mountains, plants, and animals, you name it. They are all experiencing just as we are, and they talk when they move on just in different ways than us. And animism is a way of relating to those phenomena that bestows reciprocity of those relationships. Before you write this off, I want to point out that this is fundamentally different from the stale, mechanical views of nature in Western society. For a long time, non-human animals, plants, and landscapes have been deemed as set processes, and human consciousness has been placed above them. Animism asserts that human consciousness is another emergent property, one gift among many, that nature is not simply a set of mechanisms, but living and experiencing in many forms as an active sense. And how do we begin to understand this? Because it can be very hard. One example can be seen in the Ojibwe language, which is used verbs for bodies of water instead of nouns. The direct translations wouldn't be lake or bay, they would be to be a lake or to be a bay, recognizing that the water could be elsewhere. And this seems simple on the surface, but it's not about the words, it's about the relationship that has resulted in their creation. Within our mechanized views of nature lies a disconnected of gives ways for extraction, exploitation, pollution, and eventually destruction. Which is why I call myself a wordsmith in my work, because words is what allows us to be captivated and to give life to those that have been seen as non-living, and to really explore those textures and those depths of what is the unknown to become known in our lives. In The Spell of Sensius, the author describes a visit to Bali where his host left offerings for the spirits, and these were neat bundles of rice and palm fronds being left at various corners outside of the house. As he went about his day, the author noticed that there was rice that was gone. Were these spirits after all? Upon closer examination, they saw ants were making a meal from their offerings. What could an animist perspective offer from this? What if the ants were the spirits beings offered too? With the family compound having so much cooking and the colonies of ants being residents of the area, there could be a huge problem, but the daily rice offerings might be holding off an invasion from a natural focuses on the land. Seemingly, this sets a boundary between the human and non-human worlds in a way that persuades the insects to respect such boundary. These are some of the sort of cultural examples that we can observe emerging from animist ideologies. There is no set practice that defines animism, but it begins to be clear what choices have been made without our connection. The decision to cover our lands with concrete, dump our waste into waterways, and allow policies that degrade our environments are not animist in nature. As such, they're processes of disappearing, and they're unsustainable. Another example is how we compare animism and biblical worldviews, where animism pushes beyond standard, examines the relationships of creating a symbiosis. Creating a solid foundation of a higher power level of love is an ultimate system of existence rather than looking at it as a singular issue within a prayer. In animism, spirits are seen as instruments of magic that represent a duality of both harm and healing, depending on the experience and the ways that species interact with them. And in religious, it seems that there is sometimes some salvation that needs to be done. I think animism is unique to me is that it's an indigenous worldview that has played a role in embodying the personhood within the living and non-living systems. An example of, again, as we mentioned, is that Non-living is something that we would sometimes refer as the rocks or the geography of the landscape or the mountain. We don't think of it as a living system. We're seeing it as a non-living, but we know that from Indigenous worldviews like prayer, dance, and these mechanisms and these ways to activate ourselves as forms of animism. And that is why we must build ecological wealth through animism. It's a gateway for us to understand ourselves. Animism seems like it's here to stay, and here's what's already happening. Lidwedge Ettercourt, a world-famous trend forecaster, predicted animism would increase in the coming years. And even now we see research showing to that direction of declines of certain religions and more people identifying with environmental values. There is a cultural shift in us to understanding animism and help us make the sense of a direction that things are headed. And why spirituality matters in the environmental movement to me is that we cannot talk about biodiversity without culture. And within culture, there's stories. And within those stories, there's mythologies. And within mythologies, there is the animism perspective of recognizing the personhood of these living systems. And so for me, when I approach spirituality, it's not so much of wanting people to be a certain religion. It's to recognize that within each and unique religion, there are components of living and life and death and also the care for the earth. And that's where I think where animism really has allowed me to be used in this movement as a way to connect with others who are often not as concretized in their area within, I would say, the data and facts. And not to say that data and facts don't matter, because they really do in environmental movements and their stories too. But I believe that animism and spirituality can be a really huge gateway for a lot of people to ground themselves in interconnectedness. And it's really helped me to value species around where I felt that I didn't really think about the fungi, fauna, and flora as these sacred species. Not to say I didn't see them as living, but I saw them as living, but not so much as the sacredness of what I can learn from them. And so when I remember myself going through a lot of things in life the last few years in my career, I remember going to the forest, and in this forest I would go to this lake, and in the lake I would sit down, and I remember crying or telling the lake what was wrong with me. And as I talked to the lake, and as I talked to the trees and the bushes and the trees that were there, I felt in my own mind like the ways that the non-living, those living species were talking to me, of recognizing that there is essence in patience, that there is essence in forgiving yourself, and that there's essence in grieving. And I don't think that, it's not to say like my friends wouldn't provide that either, but it's to say that we find different forms of healing and to rest and to grieve those situations in our lives that perhaps many of us who are broken and fragmented and disconnected from a lot of these movements also need those types of experiences. Because I think when we're allowed to put our experiences within certain words, and which is why, animism to me means is that it helps illustrate the feelings that a lot of us feel. And I think that's why a lot of people seek those words, is that it validates them. It allows them to recognize that they're not insane or that this is a mental disorder, but rather a form of healthiness, of being connected to life, of caring, right? To care for species and like to care and to resist is a form of love. So to me, that is how I navigate the world, is that choosing to love in both the living and dying world is an act of humility, and with animism that can show us that humility. Thank you for watching this video on animism, and be sure to like the video and leave a comment something that you learned or topics that you'd like for me to explore, and subscribe to the channel if you like what you see. I'd also love to know, what are your thoughts on animism? Do you have relationships to animism? And what are your thoughts on spirituality within movements?